Hello friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. My name's Jeremy McCandless and you join me. I'm recording this episode live on the 6th of November 2023. And welcome to our final episode in the book of Leviticus. You've made it, friends. This is it, the final episode as we've been exploring together for a little over a month now the book of Leviticus. And it's been quite a journey through this ancient text, hasn't it? And well done. You've done it. We've done it. I know I've learned so much by doing it. It's been challenging. It's been difficult. I might even respectfully say it's probably been a little bit of a slog at times, but we've done it. I know that when I read my Bible many years ago as a young child, I reached the book of Leviticus and bang, I crashed and burned. But you and I, we've done it together. And today we're going to close off our season, episode 27, and look at this final chapter which revolves around the interesting, unusual subject of vows, oaths, promises, asking what they are and how they relate to holiness in our everyday lives. In this concluding chapter of Leviticus, it takes an unexpected turn with this exploration of these things, which really, within the framework of this chapter, are essentially described to us as promises or dedications to the Lord. So what are they and how do we value them and what is their worth? We often think of wedding vows, don't we? But this chapter will look into a much broader spectrum of what vows are and how they're made and how they're valued in different circumstances. So welcome. And if you're here for the very first time, then why not consider subscribing? Click on the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts from, and that way you need never miss another single episode. In fact, why not go back to the very beginning and make the decision to work through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, with us over the coming years. Now, if you are here today for the first time, please do hang around at the end, because I've got an update for you on the next couple of seasons, but also some information, a special bonus edition which I'll come back tomorrow, where I'm hoping, planning, praying to be able to launch a new podcast series. And I'll tell you all about that tomorrow and how to get involved and how to listen to that one as well. So with that all said, it's great that we've got here today. So let's drop back into the text and pick up where we left off last time. And I'll see you at the close. Bye for now. You know, we often don't give it much thought. We don't talk about it frequently, but a significant aspect of our life involves this thing called making a vow, making a promise. One of the most familiar to us, of course, is probably the most serious example of this sort of thing, and that is the wedding vow. We are accustomed to seeing a bride and a groom exchange their vows at a wedding ceremony. However, there are various occasions in life when we find ourselves making promises, making vows, and sometimes they're quite unaccepted, and sometimes it's sad to say we sort of quite flippantly make them. We probably all do that sort of thing at certain times. So if you've done it, if you've made a promise to yourself or someone else that you've not taken seriously, just remember you're not alone. Many of us experience such moments. You know, we've probably all been there. Found ourselves in some desperate circumstances and we sort of naturally turn to divine help. And maybe we make a promise in the process of doing it. Foxhole spirituality, I've heard some would call it. It seems that there are not really any atheists in foxholes when the enemy is over the horizon. And maybe that's how we feel sometimes. Maybe you've just lost your wallet or your phone or your keys in the past, and you found yourself suddenly making a promise to God, if only He will help you find the wallet, if only things will turn out for you like you want, then you will do something in return as a thanksgiving. So often, at a very natural level, everyday vows, everyday oaths are often in response to something lost or something we want to gain back or something we want to happen in a certain way. Which really makes me wonder, what is it we're really meant to promise the Lord? Because if this is a sort of worldly template of something which as a principle was established by God, then how should we really promise to the Lord? How should we really attempt to make a vow to recover that which was lost? Now, interesting for us in our closing study in Leviticus today, it takes a rather fascinating turn. For this is an entire chapter of the Bible that delves into this very topic, the topic of making vows. It's the final chapter in our book together, our 28 episodes, our month together working through the book of Leviticus. Now, in effect, we reached the end of the main text of Leviticus last time at the end of chapter 26. Because it, in its sense, it marks the culmination and the closing off point of the revealing and the explanation of the Mosaic legislation. Chapter 26 was a sort of summary statement signifying that this was the end of the law. But now, with this chapter 7, it says yes, but that's not necessarily the conclusion of the subject matter. Chapter 27, Bible experts say, serve as a sort of an appendix to all the previous chapters. And in this chapter, it's important to note that the God talks about something called vows. Now, it's also important to note that he does not explicitly command that we should make vows, but he does give some guidance on how we should, when we do it, and how we should approach them. So vows are discussed here at length in Leviticus 27. So first of all, we need to define what they are. Well, I believe as they're revealed here, they're essentially promises to dedicate something. It could be oneself, it could be one's possessions, it could even be another person, a family member, or someone in your employee to the Lord. The vow is a way of seeking a blessing from the Lord, and in the process acknowledging a blessing he has already bestowed. So this chapter will outline for us the qualifications and consequences of making vows. So we're going to look at chapter 27, we're going to begin our journey in verse 1. But again, this is another very lengthy passage, and as has become our process in approaching this particular chapter of the Bible, is not to read it verse by verse. I'm going to work through it, I'm going to refer it, but I recommend you have the text by your side or open before you. There is actually a link in the episode notes where you can click through and pull up the full text we're going to cover on Bible Gateway. Other than that, just have it to hand on your phone, your app, or your actual physical Bible itself. So we're going to begin in verse 1, where it is giving us some understanding on how we value offerings. And again, at the beginning, we see the Lord speaking to Moses, instructing him to communicate with the children of Israel concerning the practice of consecration and valuation. Valuation in this context is essentially an estimate of the worth, the value of the thing that is being promised to be given to the Lord. Now, in the context of Leviticus, the vow will include various items. It could be a person, it could be their life of the individual person making the vow, it could even be an animal, a property, a house, or even the agricultural produce of the land. Now, since not all of these dedicated items described here are not going to be directly used necessarily in priestly service, provisions were made for people to offer specified sums of money in place of actual items. The financial valuation substituted and represented the transfer of the ownership of the actual physical item that was being offered. Now let's consider the details of these valuations, because it does go into some detail. When it comes to people, the valuation was determined by the individual's gender and age. In the case of a male between 20 and 60, the valuation was set at 50 shekels of silver, according to the sanctuary shekel, as it says. And this sum was presented by that person themselves directly to the priest as an offering. Conversely, if the individual was a woman, female, the valuation was reduced to 30 shekels. Now, this gender-based distinction may seem puzzling, but it's just part of a very intricate system that was in place during those times. The valuation system was very detailed and will become even more nuanced as we progress through it, and we'll see it varies depending to different age groups as well. Now, in cases where the person was unable to afford the specific valuation, a provision was made. They would appear before the priest, who would then determine a valuation based on their ability today. And this aspect reflected, I suppose, a sense of fairness and equality, and allow everyone potentially of accessibility to the system. The difference in the valuation of the male and the females, of course, would reflect the ability of men and women at that time to have an independent income of themselves. So that to put these various valuations in context, it's essential to understand that the value of the shekel at the time was equivalent to 1 month's salary. So in simple terms, this is going to be a huge, substantial financial commitment. And those who feel the valuation system undermines those of a female gender a little, you should consider and you should remember that this was a payment that was required to be offered in terms of a vow or a sacrifice. Now, these valuations may seem rather high, rather costly by today's standards, but it's crucial to understand it in the historical context, the culture in which this Levitical system is being written into were the surrounding pagan cultures at that time. And in that situation, dedication to their gods was also required, but often involved actually making a human sacrifice, so far more costly in terms of lives. So in this context, the valuations of the Israelite system and all its different levels offered an alternative to that devastating and disgusting sacrificial system that was in the land there. But it was still big enough to make people understand the importance of carefully considered the implications of making such a vow as to dedicate you, in this situation, to dedicate the individual person to service of the Lord. But this passage also goes on to address the valuation in the context of animals. Clean animals were to be dedicated as offerings to the Lord, and they couldn't be substituted or exchanged once allocated. They couldn't switch them for an unhealthy, unclean animal. The clean animals were deemed holy, and at that point, when offered, they solely belonged to the Lord. In contrast, unclean animals could in fact be redeemed, but if someone wished to do that, they would have to pay the valuation value of a clean animal plus an additional 20%, as well as give that unclean animal. So it's a very intricate system of valuations, isn't it? And I would suggest the whole purpose of it is to ensure that individuals approach their vows, think about the promises they make, the consecrations they offer, the things they set aside to the Lord, with a deep sense of commitment and understanding of the ramifications. All these details surrounding the valuations, varying by age, type of offering, they're all designed to promote a thoughtful and a sense of responsibility when it comes to dedicating ourselves or our possessions to the Lord. That first of all, we must not do it flippantly, and secondly, that we should do it in a fair, equitable manner. That's the principle being established here. Dedicating something to the Lord should be a serious commitment, and something that if we are going to choose to have a system where we can represent it financially, then of course it must be a substantial financial burden. This chapter's purpose serves, and all these rules serve to remind us of the weight of the consequences before making any sort of vow to the Lord. So moving on, the text discusses property, houses, fields. All these things can be dedicated to the Lord. If someone decides to dedicate their house to the Lord, the priest is actually sent to assess its value, to decide whether it's in good or bad condition and how much it is worth. The idea of dedicating a house to the Lord still stands in principle today. It's sort of there symbolically to represent a desire for a person or a household to have God's presence within it, and allow God to be the one who brings the blessing into that home and family situation. Now later on, an individual was allowed to buy back their house. That was entirely possible, but they had to pay that initial valuation plus this additional 20% that we see described many times when it comes to the principle of restoration. This additional cost emphasizes the seriousness of dedicating one dwelling to the Lord, in the fact that there will be a cost if you want it back later on. When it comes to dedicating a field, we have details of how the valuation is based on the remaining years until the next year of Jubilee, which we covered a few chapters ago. The proximity of the year of Jubilee, of course, affects the valuation of the field. We discussed that at length, in fact, a little while ago. This valuation reduced as we got nearer to the year of Jubilee date and reflects the importance of understanding the timing and circumstances of when making such dedications, taking into account anything that might affect what we're offering in the longer and the medium term. And as with the house, if the person wants to redeem that field, buy it back, then it's an extra 20% on top of the original valuation. And then finally the chapter goes into the dedicating of animals, particularly those what are called firstborn unto the Lord. These animals are deemed holy and special and are deemed to have belonged to the Lord since birth. But in contrast, if an unclean animal is to be dedicated, it can be redeemed by paying the valuation of the clean animal plus again the additional 20%. So here we are. We've gone through this. We're up to the end of verse 28 and we've seen a detailed exploration of all aspects of dedicating all sorts of assets to the Lord and valuations for those particular dedications, if they're to be substituted in any way with a monetary value. And that applied to all things, whether it was possessions, animals, houses, fields, or even people. Now we delve into the specific rules and conditions surrounding these offerings themselves. You see, in verse 29, the text offers us an exception. It talks about those who are doomed to destruction. So here we have a situation where it's describing individuals who are facing the death penalty for a severe violation of the law, in which case it says no redemption is possible in such cases. So this is underlining, giving us a serious reminder of the gravity of certain offences of disobedience against the law, certain previously revealed laws of God that carried the consequences of what we would today call a capital offence. And this exception that you could not redeem such people or offer them in sacrifice or their value in sacrifice under the significance of being obedient to these certain serious capital laws that were revealed in the Old Testament, those that were revealed to be worthy of death. And what that does, from a New Testament perspective, looking back on the Old Testament, it illustrates for us the limitations of the redemptive sacrificial system that was available to people under this Old Testament framework. That limit, of course, has been removed under the New Covenant and under Christ and his sacrifice and his offering for the forgiveness of sin. Now, one other sort of side topic that often arises when discussing these Old Testament principles is that of tithing. In the Old Testament, tithing indeed was seen to involve around 10% of one income. But it wasn't always that simple, because according to the Levitical law, there was a tithing cycle, if you like. Yes, there was a yearly 10% tithe, but there were also second and third additional tithes on top. And when you break them down, the total giving over a 3-year period was actually 23 1/3%. So it's important to recognize that if you're going down the tithing route dogmatically, it wasn't that flat 10%, as people often say it is in the Old Testament. But what does the New Testament say about this? Are we bound by the law's requirements, such as giving 10%? Now, tithing itself in the New Testament is notably absent. Jesus mentions tithing, but that was when he was referring to it under the Old Testament covenant. He was talking in the New Covenant about what went on in the Old Testament situation. In the New Testament, we find something slightly different. We find guidance on giving rather than legalistic tithing. The Bible, when looking at it from the New Testament perspective, doesn't specify a set percentage, but rather encourages us to give willingly, cheerfully, and generously. Now, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 16, is an example of this. In verse 1, he's seen to be discussing, facilitating a collection for the saints in Galatia. And it's worth noting that in this passage, he's not seen to prescribe a specific tithe, but instead emphasizes they should regularly, purposefully give. And that, I believe, reflects the principles of the whole New Testament and Jesus' attitude, not just to this and all things. Our giving, whether it be of ourselves or our financial resources, is now meant to centre on a heart-driven desire to support the work of the Lord and to be thankful for him. What's interesting here is that in Corinthians, when it's talked about in some detail about giving, what we see in practice is what we might today call proportional giving. So on the first day of the week, they would set aside something to contribute to this weekly offering within the gathering context. But the key term in this context is that they give as he or she may prosper. So Corinthians absolutely takes the understanding that our contributions should align with our level of prosperity, reflecting this New Testament principle of giving in a proportion to what one has. So although in the New Testament tithing is not explicitly mentioned and the focus shifts to the giving of the heart, New Testament believers, it seems, are encouraged to give willingly and generously and proportionally as they are led by their faith and commitment to God. Another helpful passage on this is found in 2 Corinthians, the whole chapters 8 and 9. I don't have time to read them all for you today, but for a more comprehensive understanding, shall we say, of giving in the New Testament, I encourage you to turn to 2 Corinthians, especially those chapters. They provide a wealth of information on the New Testament perspective of giving, and it's here we find detailed guidance on how Christians should approach giving. But I'll give you a very quick, almost one-sentence overview of what I believe it says there. I think it's encapsulated in 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7, where it says, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful, a happy giver. So the New Testament principle absolutely emphasizes our giving to be voluntarily. It isn't about rigidly adhering to a predestined percentage, but giving joyfully and underlining the pleasing nature of giving. Now, of course, our giving to our local Christian community should be proportional to how God has prospered us, but we also, on top of that, need to leave ourselves open to be moved by the Spirit to give when circumstances and situations present themselves. So how should you determine what you're giving? What factors should you consider? Well, I believe there are a few considerations. Now, we can see that Abraham, of course, practiced tithing, which meant he gave 10% of his wealth. So tithing is not wrong. You may choose to do that, but you're not under compulsion to do that. But you are free, and certainly it's a reasonable way to fulfill that idea of giving proportionally. But it's also important to note that although it existed in the Old Testament, in fact it existed before even the Mosaic Law was given. I actually believe the New Testament principle, the understanding, expands on the principle of tithing by suggesting giving in proportion to your prosperity, but combine that with the principle of sowing and reaping, a seed ministry, a seed attitude, if you like, hoping to give by sowing generously, hoping to enjoy and see reaping generously also. So Corinthians, particularly Corinthians chapter 2, emphasizes the principle and the power of being generous in life. It reminds us that God is capable of pouring grace upon us in abundance and ensuring that we will always have a sufficiency of all the things we need, even if we're giving generously. By giving generously at the end of the day, we're able to participate in the work of the Lord, allowing us to enjoy the benefits of seeing that work come to fruition. So in summary, I believe the New Testament encourages voluntary, cheerful, and proportional giving. But I can say no more than that. The focus must be on the heart, on giving from the heart, not driven by cold, hard, legalistic, predetermined percentages. It's meant to be about the joy and generosity of contributing to the Lord's work and living a life of thankfulness to Him. If someone is dogmatically saying to you that you should or must give 10%, I would be tempted to remind them that if they really want to stick legalistically to the Old Testament framework, then we should all be giving 23.33%. You see, the New Testament rules and guidelines on giving are not in any way about fulfilling any form of legal obligation. It's all just meant to be about us expressing our devotion and trust in the Lord, supporting Him and His work with a joyful, thankful heart and a generous spirit. So as we and each or any of us give and support the Lord's work, the most important thing is to keep the New Testament principles in mind and remember it's the willingness of your heart and the joy of giving that matters the most. Okay, let me conclude by having us consider one more passage in the New Testament in relation to vows and oaths, of which, a definitive statement if you like, of which tithing is of course part of all this. So one more passage on oaths, promises, vows from a New Testament perspective. And this is important to note because this is Jesus speaking here. Matthew 5:33-37 says this: Again you have heard that it is said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is His footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, because you cannot even make one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. Wow. So here's the principle. It's simply this: let your yes be yes and your no be no. So does that mean you don't need to make an oath? You don't need to swear. You don't need to say something, but simply say yes and mean yes and no mean no. You see, the principle here, it's not at all talking about making legal agreements or the need to sometimes underpin those legal agreements by taking oaths or signing documents as we would today. The principle that Christ is revealing here is saying to you, as Christian believers, as disciples, making an oath should not be necessary, as making an oath cannot make a true statement truer. And by swearing an oath, it will not make a false statement true either. So what he's saying here is that we should be able to say that I am simply a man or woman of my word. The days are probably gone when you could make an agreement with someone verbally and it would be good as a written contract. But in a sense, that's kind of the spirit that the New Testament is after here. So simply, when you make a promise, you should keep it. A Christian who is living his life in the right way would never dream of utilizing the name of God to try and back up a statement or a promise they made in this way. This is just about character. It's about moral integrity, that you will do what you say to do. You see, at that time, the scribes and the Pharisees of Jesus' time were using God's name to swear oaths that they didn't need to keep because they didn't believe it applied to people who were outside the children of Israel. So they'd use God's name to swear oaths, to give kudos, if you like, to promises that they had no intentions of giving. And that's the background Jesus is writing into here. Okay. Let's close off by going back into the book of Leviticus for a last time. So how do we tie all this up? If this book is about being holy and being set apart for the Lord, how do we interpret it as Christians today as a way of helping us to set our lives apart for the Lord? Well, I believe there have been two basic things revealed to us that we need to know. You know, you can go through all these rituals. We've heard them all, haven't we? All this stuff that God gave us, the ceremonial laws, the moral laws, these things given to Israel, so that they may be set apart to Him for fellowship. So you can read the book of Leviticus, you can see the rules, you can see the regulations, you can see the rituals, and you can try and follow them. But then what happens? Your religion just becomes ritual. That's what the Pharisees had done in Jesus' day. They took the Old Testament and they tried to keep all the laws, and they were proud of themselves. In fact, they created new laws on top of the old laws so they wouldn't break any other laws in how and the way they approached and outworked those laws. They had so many laws that they became hypocrites because they couldn't actually do what they believed God really wanted them to do. Because very simply, God had done all this stuff to say, look, I want to regard you as my special people, the people who belong to me. So you can read Leviticus and get all the rituals which the Lord ordained, and you can get hung up on them and miss the ultimate purpose of the rules, the things that the rituals were meant to draw people's attention to draw people into a state of fellowship with God. So how today are we made fit to be in the presence of a holy God? Well, Hebrews 4 tells us. Hebrews 4 verses 14 and 16 says this, "But now, seeing that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." You see, friends, ultimately, the book of Leviticus is symbolic. It's symbolic, but in the New Testament, we approach God through the new high priest, which is Jesus Christ, which means we don't turn our back on the reality of God's love and being set apart for love and companionship with him. We have access to his person, his presence, through a person, not a ritual. Religious rules in life turn the doctrine of the grace of God just into a set of religious external obligations. Rituals, as revealed here, of course they're real, but they were meant to teach spiritual lessons. They were meant to teach the people how they could have the right attitude to approach God and have fellowship with him. They're revealed to one of the very first, many would say the first society set up in world history. So the ultimate issue is still the same. It's how do you have a personal relationship with God and apply what these guidelines teach and what they were meant to point to. The reality of all this is Levitical rules were meant to be a picture, an earthly picture of a heavenly reality. And the reality is, if you really love someone, you don't just carry a picture of them around saying, this is the person I love. You spend time in their presence, you get to know them, you put them first, you serve them. Leviticus stands as a picture revealed 4,000 years ago as how a people, a nation should be set apart from God. But don't get wrapped up, don't get absorbed with just looking at the picture, because now we have God's presence. The book of Leviticus is a picture, but when you're in the presence of what the picture illustrates, there's no need really to be gazing at the picture anymore, because you have the real thing. You're in the presence of the real thing, because God, by his Holy Spirit, now lives in you and accompanies you every day. And that's what Leviticus points to. And for this, we can be truly thankful. Okay, that's it for today. We've done it. We've finished the book of Leviticus. I'll be starting off on a new season, but I'm having a few days out. I'm working on it. These podcasts generally are recorded about 2 weeks ahead publication date. But tomorrow there's going to be a bonus episode revealing my plans for a potential new podcast series that I'm planning to launch. So if you want to hear about that and hear about how you can support it if you want to make sure it gets off the ground, just come back tomorrow and I'll tell you about that. So there's going to be a couple of bonus episodes. I'm going to have about 2 weeks from your point of view off. I'm going to have a little bit of time to set aside prepare the next main season. So there's going to be a little bonus season in between. There's going to be 12 days where I'm going to post something that I previously put on Patreon and my LinkedIn page. A series of talks I gave. Actually, it's the soundtrack of 12 videos that I placed in those places, initially created to help a community of pastors and evangelists in Pakistan who had no background in expository preaching, helping, I trusted, some people develop a skill and a gifting of how they may approach preaching out of the Word of God. So I'm just going to share those for 10 or 12 days, during which time I'll be working on getting myself ahead with the Gospel of Luke, which is going to be the main thing for quite a while now. I reckon it's going to be 70 to 80 episodes, so around about 3 months. If you don't follow how we do it here, the Bible Project Daily Podcast, the plan is to work through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. But I pretty much found early on, someone I think pointed out to me, and I thought, wow, that's true. If I do it in chronological order, Old Testament by New Testament, it'll be 7.5 years before anybody even gets to read or hear what Jesus has to say. So the process is we're doing Old Testament, New Testament, all the way through like that. So we did Genesis, then Matthew, Exodus, then Mark, Leviticus, we just finished today, and then the next main season will be the Gospel of Luke. But like I say, there's going to be 12-day gap where I'm going to post some bonus episodes, a little mini bonus season if you like. I hope you stick with it, but then picking up again the main thing. Let's keep the main thing, which is the Bible, the Word of God, and working together through it. So the Gospel of Luke. So thank you for joining me. If you've got a moment, check out the episode notes page. It should be there wherever you're getting your podcast from. There'll be a link to where this podcast is hosted on the Bible Project at buzzsprout.com, and you'll also find links there to ways in which you can connect and receive additional free resources. Within the episode notes page on Buzzsprout, there's always a overview, a short précis of everything that's been said in the main talk, as well as in fact a full transcript, pretty much a full text of what I've used to create this podcast itself. So with that all said, fantastic to have you with me. Thank you for joining me. We've made it. We've finished the book of Leviticus, and I'll see you back here tomorrow on a new season of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.